Hello everyone, welcome back. As usual, it's been a little bit of time since my last video, but now I am in Mississippi and I'm going to be starting my PhD in clinical psychology next month. Woo, it only took 6 years of applying to finally get in. But I'm excited to be able to start and I'm excited to be able to share what I learned with you and the insights that I gain over that program over the next few years. So I'm hopeful that you'll be watching this channel and I will try to upload more content than I have over the past year or two in the next few years as I move forward through my education. With that said, today I want to talk about a topic that I think is really important, and it's the idea of how identity can shape your personality and vice versa. When we talk about personality, especially on this channel, we talk a lot about the cognitive aspects, we talk a lot about the traits, but I think we tend to gloss over things that are more high level or conceptual in nature, the kind of person we want to be and how thinking about this kind of person that we want to be can shape our everyday lives and the actions we take. So today we're going to be looking at how identity can shape your personality. Let's get into it. I think it's first important for us to distinguish what the difference is between personality and identity. Personality, as you know, is the consistent traits, behaviors, cognitive aspects that are present throughout your life. They're going to be these kind of underlying aspects of who you are and the kind of person that you are in all the different roles of your life. It kind of carries over between the roles throughout your life. Identity is a little bit more conceptual, it's a little bit higher level, in that it shifts depending on the kind of person you are at the moment based on the role that you need to be playing. So, for example, you could have multiple identities in life. You could be student, you could be parent, you could be teacher, you could be brother, sister, etc., etc. And all of these identities are going to be something that are going to further shape your actions and behaviors beyond your underlying personality. Now, these two things interact with each other, right? Like your personality is going to feed into your identity, and your identity is going to feed into your personality. But it's really important to understand how they are different before you look at how they then are feeding into each other. So, the identity is going to be something that is related to the roles that you have in life or the roles that you want to be having in life. And sometimes even the roles that you don't want to be having in life can be something that can shape your sense of identity as well. A really simple metaphor to help you understand this might be to think of an actor. The personality is kind of the actor itself, who they are, the traits that they have, the person that they are underneath the role that they're playing on stage. Whereas the identity is the role that they are playing on stage. It shapes and shifts depending on who they need to be, why they need to be that person, and how that person is going to act in different contexts, right? Someone who is super serious, for example, might play well into an identity or character that is super serious as well, but it might be challenging for them to be in a role that is going to be less serious, that's going to be someone that is maybe talkative, for example. Maybe you have a teacher and they need to play the role of, I don't know, a car salesman, someone who has to be talkative, extroverted, charismatic, these sorts of things. And we're not always going to see that there's going to be congruency between the personality or the actor and the identity or the role that they are playing. So, how are these two things going to be feeding into each other? How does personality influence identity and vice versa? Let's look at someone who's conscientious, someone who's quite conscientious. Maybe they're like 80th percentile conscientiousness, or someone who's like a J in the Myers Briggs system. This person is likely going to refer to themselves as a perfectionist or someone who's hardworking, someone who gets things done on time. These are examples of sub identities or smaller identity like components of the self that don't really make up the entirety of who we are. Say, for example, like parent is like a higher level identity, but something like a perfectionist or hardworking person is an example of like a lower level identity. Well, when you start to identify with something like the label of perfectionist because it represents traits of who you are, now you have something that you kind of have to live up to. It becomes almost like a self fulfilling prophecy, where if you're someone who believes yourself to be a perfectionist, when you're in a situation or scenario where perfectionism could be beneficial or it's something that you could be doing at that moment, you're more likely to express those traits, which then further reinforces the already conscientious personality traits that you have. This is something that can also be seen in the other personality traits, sometimes even negatively, with something like neuroticism. If you're someone who believes yourself to be an anxious person, you tie the label or identity of being an anxious person to yourself. When you're presented with a situation that is going to maybe provoke anxiety within you, you might think to yourself, oh, well, I'm an anxious person, so maybe I'm just going to respond anxiously or neurotically to this specific situation. And this identity then reinforces the personality trait, and the personality trait then reinforces the identity even further. This then leads into something known as role investment and trait amplification. So, this is when you enter into a new role in life, and it's something that could have a serious or meaningful impact or change on your overall personality because you've adopted some sort of new role. Let's say you take on a new leadership position. You go from working as a worker to working as a manager or leader in some sort of job, field, school project, something like that. And it's something that's going to be relatively long term. Before, you might not have thought about yourself as a leader, but maybe you step into that role and maybe you start to see, oh, maybe I'm a little bit better at this than I thought. Maybe I do have leader like qualities. And you start to kind of lean into those qualities about yourself. And it's almost like you're unlocking a little bit of your own personality. When we look at personality, I've talked about in the past the idea that we kind of have a standard deviation of our own personality. Say for example, if you're someone who's like 20th percentile introversion, you might be able to, from day to day or situation to situation, show behaviors that represent something like, maybe from 5th percentile to like 45th percentile. So maybe if you're someone who's usually like 40th percentile introversion, or sorry, extroversion, which would make you an introvert, you're on the under half of the extroversion bar, so someone who is an introvert, maybe you then adopt some slight extroverted qualities when you step into a leadership position. Maybe it's something that tires you out, but also maybe it's something that you deem important because it's a new identity or label that you've associated with yourself, and it's something that you think is something that you really want to be doing. It's part of who you are, it's a new identity. So this amplifies the personality trait and kind of temporarily changes your baseline and moves it to somewhere else within that standard deviation of scores that you could have within yourself. Is this something that's going to be long term sustainable? Well, that really depends on whether or not the new identity or position that someone is working within is congruent with the base personality that they have. Earlier, we talked about the idea of maybe the teacher becoming a car salesman. Maybe that very introverted teacher could pick up the car salesman position for a little while, and it might even be exciting for them for a little bit to do something that's new and different. But is it going to become a core aspect of their personality and identity? Probably not, because it's something that's going to not be in congruence with that base level of personality. So, identity is something that is usually based on the base personality, but it is something that can also change the base personality based on what we need from that identity or position and how we specifically feel about that identity or position. That's going to be something that's really important, is the feelings associated with the identity that we are now adopting. This leads into the idea of the ideal identity, which is a mouthful. So, the ideal identity represents the person in our mind that we really want to be. Maybe as a kid, you remember watching a TV show and there was a character that you really liked, and maybe you copied some of their traits, behaviors, characteristics. You just thought they were really cool and you wanted to be like them, so you copied them a little bit. And maybe over the course of your life, you kept some of those traits that you copied just because you were doing them so often and you really idealized this character or what they represent. That's the idea behind the ideal identity. Again, I know that's a mouthful. It's the person that we really want to be. And when we're younger, this is usually represented through some sort of like fictional character or something along those lines. As we tend to get older and dive more into our own identity and who we are, we usually start to think more about an idealized version of the self. Who do I want to be? What are the characteristics and traits that I want to represent? And how can I act to work towards those specific traits that I think are really important for me to represent in my daily life? Let me give an example of my own life. I'm someone who's relatively conscientious. I'm somewhere in like the 70 to 80th percentile conscientious. So I'm a little bit more than average, but I'm not like the most conscientious person in the world. But I do think conscientiousness is a trait that I really, really value internally. And oftentimes I will act in such a way that represents a person that is more conscientious than I actually am. So let's say, for example, like I accidentally like knock something over or drop a piece of trash. My first instinct might just be to be like, whatever, I'll get it later, or whatever, it's not that important, I'll just leave it. But then in my mind, I literally have the active thought of like, what would a highly conscientious person do in this situation? And they would go back and pick up the thing immediately. They would go back and fix the problem as it was caused because that's what a conscientious person would do. So, therefore, I make that decision and then I further reinforce the idea that I am conscientious within myself. And therefore, I express as maybe more conscientious than I actually am. But here's the weird thing, if I'm consistently and daily acting more conscientious than I actually am, quote unquote, am I really not as conscientious as I actually thought I was? Like, where am I on the conscientious scale if I'm willing to actively think about conscientiousness, taking those actions when I need to, and doing it consistently? So it's a weird kind of paradox where your personality can influence the identity. And if it does it so consistently, you might actually kind of outperform your base personality, your base traits, your base urges when it comes to different situations. So it's really important to think about the ideal self and the ideal person that you want to be, and then kind of drill into your brain like, what would they do in the situation that I'm in? And what can I do to maybe even do just a little bit of that? How can I work towards being this idealized version of myself? And I don't want to pretend like I'm perfect and every single time I always make the conscientious decision because sometimes I don't. I'm human. I am lazy every now and then. So it's important to know that it's an ongoing effort to work towards your idealized self, and you never really reach the perfect idealized identity. If you just suddenly like became the idealized self and then never changed, that would be really weird, right? Like you just never grew again. And as we get older, we should also expect to have our values change with age and with wisdom as well. So, all in all, identity is something that's going to be changing and growing with you, hopefully. All of these thoughts and ideas about identity and personality are really here to hopefully give you the idea that if you want to make some sort of meaningful change in your personality, one avenue to do it through is identity. It can be a really strong way for you to make an overall change in your life. And this is something that I really hammer home in coaching with clients who I think may be stuck in a rut in life, or maybe they're not sure where they are, where they want to be going in life. They really don't have a sense of identity for themselves. And I've talked about in the past the idea of James Marcia's identity development. And this is a kind of simplified identity system that talks about, achieving your identity, or maybe you're in some sort of moratorium where you don't know, or maybe you're in a sense of identity foreclosure where someone's decided your identity for you. Like maybe you're the son of a baker, so therefore you have to become a baker, right? So there's a lot of different routes that identity can take, but I think it's important for people to really think about the identity that they want out of life and what can they then do to work towards that daily, within the small interactions of their life, and how can they reinforce to themselves in their daily actions the type of person that they want to be. And another way that you can approach this is thinking about the kind of person that you don't want to be. Like, I know I don't want to be someone who's dirty, or who leaves dishes around, or is someone who's going to not turn my stuff in on time, right? So I make sure to avoid those components of living, those identity components, and I do the opposite, where I do turn things on time, or I make sure that I clean my room occasionally, so on and so forth. So avoiding the identity components that you don't want to be can be just as meaningful as approaching the ones that you do want to be associated with yourself. So all in all, what I'm really trying to say here is that identity is really important in shaping your personality, but also vice versa, where your personality is likely going to be the launching point for the identity components that you have about yourself. But that doesn't mean you can't work beyond those, right? Especially when you're thinking about something like neuroticism. Maybe you think of yourself as an anxious person, but that doesn't mean you can't work towards a different identity or work towards something that's like, I'm not an anxious person, or I'm someone who has my emotions under control, or I'm someone who's overcome the anxiousness within myself, right? Adopting a new identity can be a great way for you to have these drastic and major changes in your personality, especially if you give them time to grow and adapt with the situations that you're experiencing in life. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. I would like to remind everyone that I do have personality assessment sessions as well as coaching at my website, which you can see down below. I also have a new service that I'm offering. There's a lot of academics out there, and I worked as a college counselor for years. Now I'm performing a CV, curriculum vitae review service, where if you would like me to look over your CV or resume and how that might work towards applying towards a graduate program or a job. I'm someone who's worked in college counseling, and I've worked with hundreds of people looking at their resumes, statements of purpose, these sorts of things. So I have a new service where you can pay me, and I will then review your resume, your CV, and then I will have notes and edits. I will send those back to you, and then we'll have a follow-up call to talk about those edits and reviews, and we can see if we can figure out what's going to work for you and how to get you closer to the goals that you want to be having, whether it's in academia, whether it's in the job field, these sorts of things. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good one.